But tell me about what it was like. 14-year-old, you were Sarah Bailey then, 14 years old, going to Barcelona with the British Paralympic team. What was that like?
It was everything I'd dreamed of. I watched the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984 when I was 6. And I was just so mesmerised by the whole games. And I said to my mum that I wanted to go to the games in 92, wherever they were, because I'd worked out, like Sarah Hardcastle was 15 in 1984, I would be nearly 15 by the time we got to 92. And I wanted to be like Sarah. And I just wanted to do whatever sport it was. I didn't really mind. I was erring on the side of swimming. I was a reasonably good swimmer as a little girl, and I just wanted to go to the games, wanted to feel that pride of pulling on the GB tracksuit and trying to, compete to be the best I could be. And yeah, it's all I had ever dreamed of. And going with some of the athletes that I now still consider my mentors kind of makes it all the more special. So, people who have been there my whole career, who are doing other things in public life now as well. People like Tanny Gray-Thompson, just to name one. It's amazing to think of what they gave me as such a young athlete when I was at that first games. I think the thing back then was the Paralympics was relatively under the radar. We had a little bit of coverage every few days, but most of the people who were competing also had full-time jobs. So there was not very many full-time athletes at that point. And so it had a different sense of people were doing this not because it was their career as such, it was because it was something that they desperately wanted to do alongside a full-time job as well.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because we were both there for that transition to lottery funding, weren't we, post-Atlanta? And then, I was lucky enough to work with the swim team and remember that kind of collective team spirit we had. Everybody was, working to help everyone else, and going into Sydney. And that was an amazing games. What do you remember of Sydney?
Well, I think the thing about Sydney was that it suddenly got huge. So Atlanta had been pretty big in a sense that it was an American Games, but we were an afterthought in Atlanta. It was the final games where there had been 2 different organising committees. So then to go on to Sydney, where it kind of really came of age in a sense that we as British athletes had lottery funding for 3 or 4 years. There was a great many more full-time athletes. I'd just finished my degree in Leeds, and so I was starting to get used to the concept of being a full-time athlete, and the games was big. There was all sorts of extra things within the village was bigger, there was more commercial side to it as well, and then of course that swimming pool with a temporary stand of 17,000 people. That was unheard of. And I remember being very grateful that my coach Colin Hood had taken me to the pool the day before I was due to compete, because he said, Sarah, you need to see this full. And it was a heat session. And I think, I can't remember who was racing, but I just remember thinking, wow, that is amazing. And it was good to see it because you wouldn't have wanted it to distract you, because it was like nothing a para athlete had ever seen before.
But swimming then changed to cycling. So tell us about that transition.
It was a bit of a surprise to me as well, I think. I'd gone to the games in Athens, and it was a memorable games for me, not least because my mum had been diagnosed with breast cancer literally 3 weeks before we flew. And she'd had her surgery and she was putting off the start of chemotherapy so she could come and watch the games. But during the games, I met a cyclist called Barney Storey. And he was staying in the apartment directly above my swimming apartment. And all of his teammates seemed to be chatting me up on his behalf, because I'd sit down in the food hall and the cycling team we'd all sit together, all the different sports. And I'd get things like, you've got a good strong pair of legs on you, girl. You should give cycling a go and all this. And so I did. After the games in Athens, I went down to the Manchester Velodrome to see what all the fuss was about. It became a bit addictive, the idea of whizzing round this steep banking, and I was just kind of mesmerised by the sport. And I'd been really quite taken by the individual pursuit, which is where you chase from one side of the track to the other to try and catch the other person. And I thought, oh, well, if I was a cyclist, the individual pursuit would suit my personality, because it's a solo event, but you're chasing someone down. And it just seemed quite an exciting thing. And at the same time, simultaneously, I'd started picking up ear infections. and I was kept out of the water for a considerable amount of time in the first 6 months of 2005. The doctors told me that my ear infections were just at the point where if I kept on getting my ears wet, even washing my hair, there was a real chance that the ear canal would never recover. And they weren't really sure why it was so stubborn to leave my ears. So they told me I had an indefinite amount of time where I was not allowed to get my ears wet under any circumstance. And that was quite hard to hear, because I'd been taping my head up and going for a swim and pretending there was no water in my ears. And I was just like, oh, okay. So that means like no kick sets or anything. They said nothing that could result in you getting your ears wet. And British Cycling had found out about my sort of challenges that year with my ears. And so they offered me to do a trial over 3,000 metres, which is the distance of the individual pursuit. And I ended up being just the second outside of the world record at that point.
Wow.
So they selected me to go to the European Championships, which was 3 weeks later. And I effectively had 3 weeks of proper training, during which time the Tour de France was finishing. And Barney would sit with me on the sofa in the evenings and explain the tactics of a road race, because in selecting me for the individual pursuits, the road racing events were the following week. So they said, we'll keep you out there for training, but then you can do the road races. And I came second in the individual time trial and I won the road race.
Wow.
And it was a sprint finish of the road race, but I'd listened to all this tactical, support I'd had during watching the Tour de France, and the racer in me just kind of like, I just let it happen. So I had a bit of a decision to make at that point, and it was a really hard one, because Colin, my swimming coach, just like the best coach you could ever wish for. So Colin helped me make the decision, and I never forget him saying, if you were my daughter, I'd tell you to get on your bike.
So if we move on to London, because London was incredible, wasn't it? I mean, for me, that was just one of the best games. Tell me about your experience there.
London's kind of the turning point really in my life, I suppose, because I'd gone into Beijing as a first-time cyclist. There was only 2 events in Beijing, because they were still trying to level up the equality of the male and female side of the sports, and also the classification system in cycling. So cycling a slightly younger sport in parasport terms compared to swimming, perhaps. So we had a few progressions within the sport between Beijing and London, and having won 2 gold medals, with Barney winning 2 gold medals in Beijing, the build up to London had a bigger spotlight, I suppose, because he and I were both selected again. And at this time I had 4 events to have a go at. And as I'd progressed as a cyclist, I'd also progressed in my ability to get the power out on the track as well, because that was a more technical thing, being able to start fast. And I'd spent some time with the women's team pursuit squad and been a part of the qualification for the Olympic Games. And so I was really developing those technical skills alongside that innate ability as an endurance athlete. So I had a very real chance of 4 gold medals from those 4 events. And so that was really what took me into London, and just taking it one event at a time, and knowing that once you got that event out of the way, you could kind of switch into the next event and the next event. And then by the time we got to the 4th race, it was a road race, 8 laps of the course out in Brands Hatch. And I hit the first corner super hard because I wanted to make sure we all got round it on my terms. And it was a tricky corner, and it went straight uphill, and I accelerated and I'd attacked unintentionally, and I was off. I was by myself. I guess it was the last 1.5 kilometres I allowed myself to believe that the 8-minute gap I had was real, and that it was going to be a 4th gold medal. So I allowed myself to celebrate up that home straight. And the commissaire came back and said, Sarah, the men are closing fast. You're going to have to speed up. Stop high-fiving everybody. So I kind of tootled my way to the finish and celebrating, and the men came in a couple of minutes later. So it was just that immense day where suddenly your life completely changed, because parasport really grew from those games. The British public embraced both games. The down that they felt after the Olympics finishing was more than well replaced by the Paralympics. And everyone was just in such a party mood. And I came back to the village, and everything was different.
Yeah, well, I remember I was at Brands Hatch when you won that medal, but I remember the first one was actually your first medal in the velodrome was actually the first medal of the British team.
Yeah.
That was such an exciting moment. You know, we finally got our first gold medal. You know, it's on the board. And I remember we had that table, didn't we, in the medical centre, and you came in, but actually you jumped into my arms with this massive hug, and we put it on the board. It was just, and then we had the front pages of, remember, I've got a photo with all the national newspapers with your photo and name on the front. We had this, all the team holding up these front pages of the photos. And I just thought then, something has changed. You know, never before has a Paralympian been on the front page of every single British newspaper. And for me, that was such an emotional and turning moment in the whole movement. And it was just fantastic to share that.
Well, it's really interesting. I don't think I've ever told you this. I had a text message from my parents that morning, and I'd kept my social media switched off, and I only had kind of a line into my family. And my dad said, whatever you do, don't look at any newspapers today. And I went to the medical centre to get like my recovery massage, and you guys had all the newspapers. And I was just like, that's why he told me not to look at the newspapers, because, whoa, that's a bit crazy. And so I had to kind of, I guess it showed just how well the mental preparation had been, because it didn't affect me. I allowed myself to look at them, and we had our photo, and we've still got that amazing picture. And I am glad that we had it. But it was just really interesting that I was able to completely compartmentalize that and put it to one side and not really think about it again. And so it was probably the best test for that mental preparation we could have ever had, because it was like nothing else we'd ever experienced. And starting to try and think about the fact that people would know who you were more, they'd have investigated you more, they'd have kind of got to love or hate you depending on their preferences, was just something that we'd never experienced. And so, yeah, I wasn't supposed to see those newspapers that day, but I am glad that
we were testing you. We were just testing your mental strength.
Yeah.
Oh dear, that's a great story. But post-London, life got more difficult, didn't it? A bit more challenging. Baby.
Yeah. So in that first few months after London, it kind of really hit home just how many people had paid attention. And I think it was the following week after the Games, I joined the Ride Across Britain, which was raising money for ParalympicsGB. And I joined at Haydock, and that finished in Penrith. And it was the most horrific day in terms of weather. But I remember arriving in a very small village just north of Lancaster, and it was absolutely chucking it down. I was soaked to my skin. And as I pulled up behind the car that Barney was driving, thinking I need chocolate, I need Coke, I need all the things I'm not normally allowed, there's these two little old ladies in their 70s or 80s running. Oh my God, it's Sarah Storey. Oh my God, it's Sarah Storey. And I was like, hello? I wouldn't have even recognised me. And I wouldn't have even known I was going to that village. I think it was Oxenholme or somewhere. I was like, hi, do I know you? No, but we know you. You're amazing. And we watched you in the whole game and your 4 gold medals, and we knew you were coming here today. And I said, how did you know? I didn't know I was coming here today. And like, we've been following the Ride Across Britain. We've downloaded the route. We know exactly where you're going, and we knew you were on the ride today. So we've been waiting here for 4 hours.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. And I'm like a miserable wreck. But they were like, no, you're not. You're wonderful. You look amazing. And it was the best thing. And I literally sprinted to Penrith after that. Because
that must have just given you this massive boost.
Wow. And that was probably the defining moment for me, was that these 2 people who had not just embraced technology and discovered the route and had researched, but they'd bothered to be out there in the rain. It was horrendous. And I was just like, you know, that made the whole thing even more poignant. But after those games, Barney and I had decided we wanted to start a family, and we were really fortunate. Louisa came bang on time 9 months later, and she's going to be nearly 7 now. So it's just amazing. And to start that whole journey to the next games with a little bundle of joy made everything even more relevant. It meant so much more in a way, because her reaction to people, to sport, to culture, to disability. You know, she doesn't come away asking like the same questions that other children ask, because she's completely accepting of how some people have mobility challenges or have limbs that won't work or work in different ways, and she just loves people.
So coming on to Tokyo, we're hoping to be there next year. Looking forward to that. How many events are you going to do there?
So there are still 4 events on the programme for my category. The same 4 events I raced in London and in Rio. In Rio, the sprint race, the 500 metres, I was 4th in that race. I'd been 5th in that race in Beijing. I won it in London. The sprinters, I teased the sprinters to say they didn't turn up that day in London, and the endurance athlete, you know, made the most of it. So I do the 500 as a kind of an extra programme filler, keeps my speed work going well, and that can be useful in a road race if you're sprinting at the end. But the road race and the road time trial, the 3,000 metres, are obviously the main focus. And those are the events that I've probably won the most at World Championships. And then we potentially, beyond Tokyo, they change the programme maybe into Paris, depending on what they think. So the Tokyo is quite poignant, really, because it could be the final time that our track programme looks the way it looks at the moment.
Okay. So what's for you after Tokyo, do you think? Have you made a decision yet, or are you still waiting to see?
I'll be waiting to see. I said that ahead of the games being this year. Next year marks the 30th anniversary of me being taken onto the GB swim team. So I went to my first training weekend with the British swim team back in the days before the British Paralympic Association was in charge of swimming. And we had all of our different disability groups looking after the different sports. And so my very first training weekend where they invited me to join the team was in November 1991. So I'll have been on an international team 30 years next year.
Wow.
So we'll see how it goes. I think the interesting thing for me is how sport's evolving and the opportunities that provides, even as an old lady like me. So, you know, I'll see how I feel, and also how the kids feel and what they're doing. And Barney, you know, Louise has told me I'm not allowed to retire ever, because she can't see a way of being able to meet all these people around the world and experience different cultures unless I'm at a bike race. So
maybe she'll be doing it, and you'll be carrying her wheels and bags and stuff.
Well, I said that to them. I said there is a possibility you could race one day, and Charlie's absolutely up for that. I think Louisa is too in a way, but Charlie's he's very capable of pedaling, but he prefers to pedal backwards, so that's quite funny. But we've got a small hill just outside our house, and he'll career down that hill on his balance bike, and then the drive kind of slopes up a little bit, so he'll use the drive to stop, because of course balance bikes don't always have brakes.
Yeah.
So he's learning his bike handling skills and frightening us already.
So in general, though, in terms of the world and disability, how do you think society's changed? You know, since you were first involved back in '91, then coming into that, and then how the world was then and where it is now, how do you think things are going?
I'd like to think there was more awareness of the needs of people with disabilities. I think we still have huge challenges, though. Not everything is as accessible as it should be. And the one thing that coming to work in transport with active travel and how that interlinks with bus and train travel is just how inaccessible our public transport system can be, and just how much more hoops you have to jump through as someone who's using a wheelchair to get around, you know, with the booking system and the access on and off trains. And so those things haven't improved as much as I would personally have liked. And obviously I don't live that every day, but I work with people who do, and you see things that people have to put up with, and access to, you know, the disabled toilet on the train's not working. Well, that's not a problem for most people because there's one at the other end of the other carriage, but it's a major problem for someone who can only be in that carriage. So all of these things that are still a problem in the 21st century shouldn't be. But in terms of people's perception, one of the things that stuck out when I first came onto the team was one of our older athletes saying, whatever you do, don't let someone tell you you're brave and courageous, because you're not. You're an athlete who's just worked hard and you deserve this. And I think that's the thing that has changed. People have started to people really understand that athletes are athletes. It doesn't matter whether they have a disability, a minor impairment, or whether they're on the Olympic team. Everyone will have their challenges. They'll all have overcome adversity in some way, and it's a personal journey, regardless of which team you're on. And so I think, you know, London did a huge amount to show what people are capable of, and to stop the sense of feeling sorry for people, because everyone has that opportunity to strive and be the best person they can be in a sporting environment. I think one of the challenges for London was people expected it to vastly change the landscape for disabled people, and it was too much of a responsibility to put onto the games. There's so much more that needs to be done outside of sport, the transport system, as I say, being one of them. But I think in terms of recognition, the sport's never been bigger, and it can continue to grow. And obviously equal coverage and more crowds. I kind of joked that if the games next year has to be held behind closed doors, for some para-athletes, that's kind of what the World Championships is like. Certainly in paracycling, we have very few spectators at the track or on the roadside when we're doing our World Championships. So it's something we're very, very used to. So those things can still improve, and we can still get better at promoting events and making them more public for people to be able to know that they're on, and therefore come and enjoy them live.
Well, I've really enjoyed chatting to you. Thank you so much for giving your time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you back in a GB shirt back in Tokyo next year.
Oh no, it's fantastic. I've been a part of the ParalympicsGB since it almost started 30 years ago. We had the anniversary last year.
Yeah.
Just being able to be a part of a team that's grown and work with people who've been a part of that, having you there the whole time is just one of those things where it makes it even more of a family. And I think that's the beauty of sport, is that everyone can do it and everyone can play a part, and the different cogs that make these things tick are just equally as important. And whilst I may stand on a podium at some point, the number of people who are directly behind me but are invisible to the people watching, but I always feel that I'm kind of stood on the shoulders of giants. So I'm very, very lucky, and I can't thank everyone enough.